He had already lived this life once. That was the part nobody at Dorasil Royal Knight Academy understood as candidates filed into the testing hall. 12 iron pillars rose from the marble floor, each one thick as a grown man's torso and layered with 50 years of defensive enchantments. The rule was simple: destroy a pillar to advance. No time limit, no other instructions. The examiners sat in their gallery chairs with the satisfied calm of people who already knew how this would go. Their pillars hadn't been touched in half a century. They had watched hundreds of talented candidates exhaust themselves against the things and leave with nothing except the memory of their own failure. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds after the exam began. A lean 14-year-old from a branch noble house walked to the nearest pillar, held out one open hand, and released a pulse of mana so dense the air distorted around it. The pillar didn't bend, it didn't crack, it came apart from the inside, the enchantments failing first, then the metal unwinding into fine dust that drifted down across the marble in a slow, almost peaceful scatter. Every examiner in the gallery went still. But to understand what that boy was, who had made him, and what had been done to him before he arrived in that hall, you had to go back more than a decade. You had to go back to the night he first died. His name had been Ash. Duke Roderick Elmheim had taken him in when he was very small, after his mother died in the mountains. Inside the main house of House Elmheim, Ash occupied an uncertain position. Not quite a son, not quite a servant, somewhere between with no official word for it. The Duke gave him a room and food and occasional training instruction, and Ash was grateful the way orphans tended to be, completely, quietly, without examination. He assumed the arrangement was compassion. Nobody told him differently. The defining fact of his life, as far as the household cared, was that he carried no wing crests. Wings were the physical organs that determined a warrior's magical capacity. Each additional wing multiplied output exponentially, and a person without them had no magic at all. In a world where the weakest noble child could shatter stone with a casual gesture, being wingless meant being nothing. Roderick's biological sons made sure Ash understood this in precise detail. Darius, the third son, was inventive about it. Small humiliations, organized embarrassments, comments calibrated for maximum damage. Grian preferred subtraction, leaving Ash off invitation lists, speaking about him in the third person while he stood in the room, reducing him steadily to furniture. Ash trained through all of it. Twice as hard, twice as long, before dawn and past dark, because he was certain effort could substitute for what he lacked. 20 years of that certainty. 20 years of working to prove himself to a man who watched from a comfortable distance and said almost nothing in return. He was wrong about every part of it. The night it ended, Ash was 23. Roderick summoned him privately, up into the mountain pass above the estate, where the wind came in sideways and snow made visibility poor. Ash went without hesitation, the way he always went when Roderick called. He stood in the clearing at the crest of the pass and waited. Roderick told him the extraction was complete. He said there was no further use for him. Ash asked what extraction meant. What had he done wrong? Roderick gave no answer. He nodded once, and from the dark came Darius and Grian with weapons already drawn, and Darius drove a blade through Ash's chest before he had time to raise his arm. The pain was immediate and vast. Ash went down on one knee, his hand pressing over the wound, blood spreading hot and fast through the snow beneath him. He looked up at Roderick. The Duke stood back a few paces with the detached satisfaction of a man watching a correctly completed transaction. Grian wanted him to know the truth before he was gone. He grabbed Ash by the collar and explained it with the casual confidence of someone unbothered by what he was saying. Ash had been born carrying 7 wing crests. Not 1 or 2 or 3, but 7. The mythological ceiling, a number that existed mostly in old manuscripts because no documented living person had actually carried it. When Roderick found Ash's dying mother in the mountains 2 decades ago and saw the crests on her infant boy's back, he recognized exactly what he had stumbled onto. He took the child not out of mercy, he took him to use. Over the following years, at precise intervals calibrated not to kill the host prematurely, specialists had extracted each crest and transplanted them into Roderick's sons. The years of training Ash had put in, the endurance he had built trying to earn his place, all of it served one purpose: keeping his body viable long enough to be completely emptied. The cold worked through the wound fast. Ash felt the ground under his knees as something distant and receding. He looked at his hands in the snow, and felt it then, faintly, nearly stripped to nothing, but present, on his back. The ghost of something that had always been there and always been taken. The remnants of crests that should have been his entire life. He died with that knowledge sitting in him like a stone. 23 years of a carefully constructed lie, and he had believed every day of it. He did not expect to wake up. Awareness came back in a rush of wrongness, darkness reversing, sensation flooding back too small and too close, and then light and cold, and the fact that his hands were the hands of a baby. Tiny fingers, blurry edges to everything, no strength in his legs, but his memories were intact, perfectly, completely present. A grown man's entire interior life sitting inside a body that couldn't walk. The mountain pass around him was the same one where he'd died. The snow was deeper from down here. He decided he was not going to cry. He had made that decision once before, as a child in Roderick's household, and he made it again now. He crawled. His legs were useless, so he moved on his stomach, hands clawing at ice, dragging himself between the drifts. Fingers went numb within minutes. The cold pressed from every direction. Somewhere behind him was his mother's body. He understood that now in a way he never had in his first life, but moving toward her accomplished nothing, so he moved away. His breathing came in short, rapid pulls. He tracked his progress by landmarks he remembered from 23 years of walking that road upright. The split pine, the rock shelf, the bend where the trail widened. He moved toward the bend. He had no plan beyond it. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel when the lantern light appeared. Voices, calm, low, not searching. A mounted retinue traveling the mountain road, led by a man in a dark traveling coat holding a lantern out over the roadside, where Ash had finally stopped moving. The man dismounted and crouched down in the snow. He lifted the infant with both hands, turning him carefully in the light. His retainers crowded close and spoke in quick, confused clusters. A baby, alone, in a blizzard, no one else visible. The man peeled back the infant's clothing at the shoulder and checked the spine. He went very still. 7 crests. Thin, clearly damaged, but undeniably present. The man looked at them for a long time without speaking. His name was Hyreed Elmheim, Viscount, branch family, older brother to Duke Roderick, though that relationship had gone cold some years back. Hyreed was not a man who displayed emotion as a rule. But looking at 7 crests on the back of a frostbitten infant found alone on a mountain road that ran directly from his brother's estate, something moved across his face that he made no effort to suppress. He wrapped the child in his own coat. He told his men they were heading home. He held the infant against his chest on the ride down, adjusting the coat against the wind without comment. At some point during the descent, the infant opened his eyes and looked directly at Hyreed's face. The look was too steady and too deliberate for a newborn. Hyreed noticed it. He adjusted his grip slightly, the way a person adjusted the handling of something that had demonstrated it deserved care. He named the boy Aster. He brought him home to his wife and daughters and announced the family had a new member. No letter was sent to Roderick. No explanation was offered to the main house. Hyreed simply placed Aster in a cradle near the window and began the business of raising a child he had found in a blizzard, as though it were entirely ordinary. The early months were their own ordeal. Aster had a grown man's complete memory and an infant's complete uselessness, and no way to bridge them except time. He watched everything. Hyreed reviewing estate accounts in the evenings, occasionally chewing the end of his pen when the numbers didn't settle. Kudo, the eldest daughter, maybe 12, putting Aster down too hard in the cradle once when she was distracted, then going still and watching to see if he'd cry, visibly relieved when he didn't. Alphen, 7 years old and already committed to conversation, pulling a chair up to his cradle and narrating her day at length. The weather, the color of the curtains, a cat she'd seen near the stables. She was completely certain he understood her. She wasn't wrong, well, not for the reason she imagined. By the time he could walk, the training schedule was mapped. By the time he could talk, priorities were set. And by the time he was old enough to train openly, the branch house's practice yard had developed an unusual occupant, a child who drilled with the patience of someone refreshing material already learned. Hyreed began sitting in on the morning sessions without announcement. He offered corrections when they were warranted and nothing else. 2 years ahead of when it would normally have been considered appropriate, he bought Aster a proper training sword. He gave no explanation. Aster didn't need one. He understood what sustained attention from a man like Hyreed meant, and he received it without illusion this time. Not as debt to be repaid, not as a test to be passed, but as something simpler and considerably harder to name. Kudo trained with him like a rival from nearly the beginning, honest, pushing, quietly satisfied when he made her work. Alphen kept talking, though now the conversations ran both directions and she started asking his opinion on things that mattered to her. The other daughters, Malfa, Freya, and the youngest, found their own rhythms with him across the years. The household was modest and the branch title carried limited political weight, but none of the people in it were cold. That distinction registered with Aster in ways he didn't examine too closely. He trained regardless. Every morning, without variation. The arithmetic hadn't changed, 7 crests slowly recovering now that the extraction pressure was gone, Roderick's sons growing stronger on stolen power, 12,000 knights under the main house's command, and a 14-year window before the academy would either sharpen him or leave him behind. He used every day of it. 10 years after Hyreed pulled him from that snowbank, the sword dance gathering convened. It was a seasonal noble event. All the great houses and their branches in one location, heirs on display. The full visible structure of the duchy's nobility assembled. The main house came at full strength. Roderick occupied the senior box. His sons arranged themselves below him. Darius, 20 years old and carrying 4 crests now. Ash's crests, operating in a body they'd never been meant for, moved through the gathering with the ease of a man who expected clear passage wherever he walked. He found the branch family table within the hour. He stood in front of it and delivered his assessment of Hyreed's household. Second-rate bloodline, embarrassing attendance, a stain on the Elmheim name. His gaze moved to Aster, and he noted that even the family's charity case couldn't generate enough mana to dent beginner training equipment. Aster said nothing. Darius reached for a cup on the table and tilted it, cold juice, slowly, across the front of Alphen's dress, holding eye contact with Hyreed the entire time. He suggested the branch house consider fewer public appearances going forward, since their presence reflected poorly on the duchy. Alphen sat very still. The liquid spread across her dress in a slow stain and dripped from the table's edge. Her posture stayed correct. Her jaw was tight. Aster stood up. Darius looked at him with something between amusement and mild curiosity. 4 wings, 20 years old, standing in front of a 10-year-old from a branch house with no visible crests and no military significance. He had precisely no reason to be concerned, and he let that fact sit plainly on his face. Aster told him, in a voice that didn't change in pitch or volume, that the insult to his sister required an answer. He was prepared to provide one in the exhibition ring if Darius preferred to settle it there. Darius accepted. Refusing would have looked worse than winning. The ring cleared. The families watched from their tables. Darius entered with a 2-handed sword and the relaxed posture of a man making an allowance. Mana rolling off his 4 crests in visible heat shimmer. Aster walked to his mark with a training blade and no readable output at all. Just a boy standing still, arms at his sides. Darius struck first, because waiting felt like taking the premise seriously. A full mana-enhanced overhead cut, real commitment, the kind of swing that finished bouts at this level cleanly and quickly. Aster stepped off the line, caught Darius's wrist on the way through, and used the swing's own weight to plant him face first into the ring floor. The noble boxes went silent. Darius got up with his expression reorganized into something considerably sharper. He brought his mana up without finesse. 4 wings, no longer bothering with form, and launched a sequence of heavy strikes. Aster moved through them without drama. He wasn't performing for the crowd. He was simply reading each strike and being somewhere else when it landed. Between the 7th and 8th swings, he hit Darius twice, once across the ribs, once on the forearm holding the sword. The blade hit the floor. Aster picked it up. He stood holding both weapons and waited. Darius's breathing was audible. His crests were still active, but there was nothing useful to direct them at. He came forward with his hands, which was desperation wearing the shape of aggression, and Aster redirected him into the ring's boundary rope, with enough force that Darius went through it and sat down heavily on the other side. Aster placed both swords in the center of the ring and walked back to the family table. He sat beside Alphen and asked if she was all right. She held his gaze for a moment, the kind of look that held more than it said, then told him she was fine. She said it with very good posture and slightly bright eyes. The gathering had gone quiet in a way it didn't go quiet for normal exhibition bouts. Somewhere in the senior box, Duke Roderick Elmheim looked down at the ring. His son was sitting on the wrong side of the boundary rope. The boy who had just put him there was 10 years old. From a branch family Roderick had considered no more significant than furniture, and he was sitting calmly beside the branch viscount's daughter without any expression of triumph at all. Roderick stood up. He descended from the senior box without haste. The crowd parted. Nobody said anything while he crossed the floor, because nobody in the room above a certain social standing needed to be told what it meant when Roderick Elmheim came down from his seat. He stopped at the ring's edge and looked at his third son sitting on the wrong side of the boundary rope. Darius got to his feet. His mana was still sputtering, 4 crests, diminished and embarrassed, and he was pressing his forearm where the bruise was already darkening. He started to speak, and Roderick cut the sound off with a single look. The expression on the Duke's face was one Ash had spent 23 years of a previous life trying never to produce, and seeing it directed at someone else was not the relief it might have been. Roderick asked his son what he had demonstrated. Darius opened his mouth again. Roderick hit him with an open mana strike across the jaw, not full strength, but enough that Darius's neck snapped sideways and he stumbled. The sound cracked across the gathering hall. At the surrounding tables, 3 people spilled their drinks. The rest went absolutely rigid. Roderick repeated the question. Darius stared at the floor and kept his mouth shut this time, which was the correct choice. Roderick told him, in a low and even voice, that what he had demonstrated was the quality of his reflection on this house. He was ordered to sit. Darius sat. Roderick turned to face the branch family table. He looked at Aster for a long time. Just looked. The kind of attention that most people at that gathering had never been on the receiving end of, and wouldn't have wanted. Aster met it without moving in his chair. Hyreed stood slowly at his own end of the table. Roderick raised one hand, mana gathering around it in a dense, visible charge, the kind used to end sparring matches quickly and conclusively, not the kind typically deployed at civilian gatherings. He looked at Aster and released it. The strike crossed the distance between them in less than half a second. Aster got his arm up. The impact hit him from shoulder to hip and drove him backward out of his chair, over it, and into the floor in a single compressed motion. The table skidded 6 inches. Alphen's water glass went over. The sound was solid and final in a way that brought the room to complete silence. A beat passed. 2. Aster's hand found the floor. He pushed up to one knee. His arm was shaking from the residual mana, but he did not stay down. He got his feet under him and straightened, one hand on the overturned chair, and then he let go of the chair and stood without it. Roderick watched him come upright. Something shifted in the Duke's expression that wasn't there before. Too fast. Too small for most of the room to track. He looked at Aster the way a man looked at a document that didn't contain the numbers he expected. Hyreed hadn't moved. His hand was flat on the table in front of him. Beside him, Kudo had gone the kind of still that came from a decision being made, whether to act, what it would cost, and she held it there at the edge of action, watching Aster stand up. Alphen had picked up the overturned glass. She set it precisely upright, though it was empty. Her hands were steady. She watched her brother stand in a room full of assembled nobility who had just seen a duke strike a 10-year-old at a ceremonial gathering, and she kept both hands on the table and said nothing. Roderick looked at Hyreed. He said across the room that the branch house's hospitality had been noted. He did not qualify what he meant by that. Then he walked back to his box, climbed the steps at the same measured pace he'd descended, and sat back in his seat as though the interruption had been minor. The gathering spent the rest of the afternoon not quite looking at either family table. On the road back to the branch estate that evening, Hyreed rode beside Aster's horse in silence for a long time before saying anything. When he spoke, it was to observe that Aster had taken a direct strike from the family head and stood back up. He said this the way he said most things, level, without embellishment, but there was a quality of attention underneath it that wasn't usual. Aster told him the blow had landed on his arm, which had distributed some of the force. Hyreed said he knew. He'd been watching. Neither of them said the more significant thing, which was that a 10-year-old had no business being able to partially absorb any amount of a duke's mana strike and remain standing. They both understood it without discussing it. The horses moved through the dark road at steady pace, and that understanding traveled with them. 2 weeks after the gathering, Hyreed called Aster into his study. The room was modest. A desk, shelves of estate records, a narrow window looking out over the training yard. Hirid sat behind the desk in ordinary clothes and placed a long object on the wood between them, wrapped in old cloth. He explained that among branch family possessions, which were not extensive, this was the most significant. He unwrapped it himself. The object was a sword hilt, and only a hilt, no blade. Dark metal, old enough that the grip leather had been replaced at least twice, and at the crossguard, a faint continuous pulse of mana that didn't belong to any ambient source. Hirid explained what it was. Graham, a cursed weapon the branch line had held for 3 generations without finding a bearer suited to it. Normal swords used the wielder's mana to enhance a physical blade. Graham discarded the physical component entirely. It pulled directly from the bearer's reserves and spun those reserves into a cutting edge of raw energy, which made it nearly inert in the hands of most warriors, since deploying it at full capacity drained even capable users within seconds. For a user with ordinary reserves, it was impractical. For a user with reserves too large to safely direct, it was the inverse, a regulating mechanism. Aster looked at the hilt on the desk. Hirid told him he was not formally passing him the branch headship. He'd have that conversation later, in the proper form, and anticipated the answer. But Graham needed a bearer before its next owner, and he thought this was the right time. Aster lifted the hilt. The moment he closed his fingers around it, the mana pulse at the crossguard responded, quickening and then steadying against his grip. He directed the smallest available output from his crests into it, a fraction of what 7 recovering wings could actually produce, and a blade formed, roughly 2.5 feet of concentrated energy, no color, clean edges, pulling stable. He looked at it for a moment, then released the output. The blade dissolved without sound. He told Hirid he would take care of it. Hirid said he knew that too. He picked up the cloth and rolled it flat on the desk with the unhurried precision of a man who had developed a practice of managing careful things. He did not say anything more significant than that, because he was generally not a person who narrated feelings when the situation didn't require it. Aster understood that this was, in the language Hirid operated in, an extensive declaration. Training continued. Another year passed. Kudo had been watching the morning sessions with increasing discontent for months. The discontent had a specific shape. She was fast, serious, technically excellent for her age, and considerably determined about it, and the person drilling opposite her in the practice yard was holding back. She knew he was holding back because she could feel the ceiling, the resistance she hit every time she pushed him, the way he never quite overextended, never committed anything he couldn't immediately take back. He matched her. He never exceeded her. After 2 years of this, she had finally mapped every inch of his deliberate self-limitation, and she was tired of it. She challenged him on a morning when ice was still on the yard, and their breath came out visible in the cold. She told him she wanted an actual match. Not the version he gave her every morning, where the outcome was decided in the first 3 seconds, and the remaining time was an elaborate performance of uncertain results. She wanted him to stop deciding what he was willing to display, and show her something real. Aster set his practice sword on the rack. He told her he wasn't certain it was a good idea. She said she didn't care what it was. She said she'd spent 2 years watching him measure everything, and she needed him to stop measuring. At least once, so she could calibrate against something honest. The thing she wasn't saying, because she wouldn't have known how to, was that she was worried about him. She had watched him be careful for 2 years. Careful about his crests, careful about his output, careful about giving the main house any clear data on what the branch family's youngest had become, and the care was correct. She understood the politics of it, but she had also seen the way he moved when he was training alone, when he thought no one was watching, and the restraint he maintained publicly bore very little resemblance to that. She needed him to be a person for 20 minutes instead of a calculation. Aster looked at her for a moment. Then he picked the practice sword back up. He let the first 3 exchanges go as usual, getting her range, confirming her footwork was where he'd tracked it. Then he stopped translating. He moved at a percentage of actual capacity that he hadn't used against another person in years, and the change was immediate and physical. The training ground between them compressing, Kudo having to accelerate to simply track what he was doing, reacting on instinct rather than read. She held the line. She was better than she gave herself credit for, more controlled under pressure than almost anyone Aster had sparred with in his previous life. She didn't panic. She absorbed the recalibration and found a new rhythm inside it, and stayed competitive with pure grit for the next 7 minutes. She lost. It wasn't close, ultimately, but she lost fighting all the way to the last exchange, and when he finally stepped past her guard and tapped her on the shoulder, she was breathing hard, and her face held the expression of someone who had received a piece of information they'd needed. She looked at him for a moment. She said that was what she thought. He told her she was excellent. She said she knew. She also said that was no longer the relevant comparison. She went inside to change for the day's other work. Aster stood in the practice yard as the ice finished melting off the flagstones and held the practice sword loosely, and thought, as he sometimes did when the careful surface slipped slightly, about arithmetic. 7 crests, still rebuilding. The gap between what he held and what Roderick's sons had been given growing narrower by the month. The time before the academy closed, what the academy would require, and what following that path would cost. He had carried these calculations for years. They weren't a burden so much as a room he lived in permanently, arranged in a specific order so he always knew where things were. Hyreed informed him of the Shadow Elders' summons on a clear afternoon 6 weeks later. The Shadow Elders were a council of the oldest Elmheim family members still alive, primarily great patriarchs and grand matriarchs of both main and branch lines who had nominally retired from direct authority, but in practice retained enormous informal power over the family structure. They did not issue summons often. When they did, attendance was not technically mandatory for branch families, and mandatory in every practical sense. Hyreed received the document with complete external calm and spent the evening reviewing estate accounts in his study, without altering his schedule. Aster knew what it meant. The main family had not responded publicly to what happened at the sword dance, and public non-response from Roderick generally preceded something else. They traveled to the Elder Council's assembly hall 3 days later. Hyreed, Aster, and a small escort. The hall was in the deepest section of the main estate, built from stone old enough that the architecture felt like another era's preference. No natural light, long corridors, fireplaces burning in the middle of the day. The smell of a building that had held significant events for multiple centuries. The assembled elders occupied the curved upper seating. At the head sat Zenas Elmheim, 6th-generation head, great-grandfather of the main line, 90 years old and in sufficient health that his age read less as deterioration than as compression. Everything unnecessary burned off. What remained very dense and very certain. He had 2 visible crests and the presence of a man who had spent 9 decades being correct. Zenas looked at Hyreed and said the branch family had been raising something unusual. He said this without preamble. Hyreed agreed that his son had shown significant capability at the sword dance. Zenas said he was not referring to the sword dance. He was referring to the fact that the branch family had been quietly acquiring a young heir with an abnormal talent profile, and he would like to understand whether this acquisition had been deliberate. Hyreed said he had found Aster on a mountain road in a blizzard and brought him home. Zenas regarded him for a moment, then looked at Aster. He told Aster to stand forward. Aster stepped to the center of the floor. He was 11 years old and standing in front of the collected senior authority of both Elmheim family lines, and he kept his hands at his sides and his posture neutral. Zenas said the boy's crests had caused disruption at a public event. The incident with the Duke's 3rd son had been noted, and the Duke's response had been proportionate, but the child's survival of that response required explanation. He asked to see the crests. Aster said nothing and did not move. Zenas looked at Hyreed. He told him, in a calm and unhurried voice, that the branch family could be managed, that its resources were within the main house's administrative reach, and that managing it in response to non-compliance was a straightforward matter. He suggested Hyreed advise his son to cooperate. Hyreed told Zenas that the child would show his crests if the elder could explain what had happened on the mountain road 11 years ago. He said this with complete stillness, no heat in it, and the direct eye contact of a man who had accepted the probable cost of a sentence before he said it. The hall went quiet in a specific way. Not surprise exactly, but the realignment of everyone's internal accounting. Zenas let the question sit for 3 seconds. Then he said that what happened on that road was a family matter above branch-level authority, and the branch family should concentrate on its own position. Hyreed said he understood. He also said Aster would show no crests today. Zenas looked at him for a long moment. He told the assembly that the branch line had become inconvenient. He suggested they confine the young heir for reassessment. Three elders reached for their summons bells. Aster took off his coat. He turned his back to the council. 7 crests sat across his spine in a column. Thin, more damaged than a natural bearer's would be, but present. Every crest, all the way to the 7th, in a complete set that hadn't been documented outside of old family records in living memory. The reaching hands stopped. Zenas leaned forward in his seat. He looked at the crests for a long time. When he sat back, his expression had done nothing dramatic, but his hands, which had been flat on the armrests, were now folded in his lap. He said this complicated things. He said, after another pause, that a 7-crest bearer represented a level of potential threat to family stability that required managed containment. He proposed a trial, specific, defined, time-limited. The estate had a sealed basement chamber. It held an undead magical creature that had been used for experimental purposes decades earlier and proved uncontrollable. No warrior under 6 crests could damage it appreciably. If the young heir could resolve the situation, his value to the family would be established, and the branch line's position would improve accordingly. If he could not, the situation would be resolved by other means. This was presented as an offer. It was not an offer. Harried put his hand on Aster's shoulder and kept it there. He told the council that if the trial ended badly, the branch family would hold the main line responsible. He said the names, ranks, and council seat positions of each elder present would be noted in the branch family archive as witnesses to the terms. One of the younger elders objected that the branch family was not in a position to make threats. Hyreed said he was making a record, not a threat. He named all 11 people in the room, titles and positions, and waited while a branch retainer wrote them down. The room was silent after that. Zenas accepted the terms. The trial was set for the following morning. Aster spent the evening in a room the estate staff had prepared for the branch family's overnight stay. The bed was narrow and the window looked out on an interior courtyard that received no direct light. He sat on the edge of the bed with Graham in his lap and didn't sleep. Not from fear. He had audited the situation carefully and didn't find fear anywhere in it. He ran the arithmetic on the undead creature. Regeneration-based enemies required saturation damage beyond the body's rebuild rate, which for regenerating undead typically meant consistent high-output strikes with minimal interval. Graham would let him run that without losing control of the draw. He worked through the approach twice, found no significant gaps, and set the sword on the bed beside him. Harried knocked at some point in the middle of the night. He came in without ceremony and sat in the room's only chair and said nothing. He was not there to brief Aster or adjust strategy. He had clearly worked through the same analysis and reached the same conclusions and arrived at the realization that nothing useful remained to be said, so he simply stayed. Aster asked him once if he had regrets about bringing him home from the mountain. Harried looked at him for a moment. He said that was a strange question. He said the boy he found in that blizzard was frozen and alone and carrying something catastrophic on his back, and bringing him home was the easiest decision he'd made in a decade. He said the current situation was a complication that he was managing, not a regret. Aster told him he understood. Harried said he knew. He sat in the chair until Aster eventually lay down and the room went quiet, and when Aster opened his eyes briefly near dawn, Harried was still there, asleep in the chair with his arms folded. The basement chamber was below the estate's old training wing, accessible by a stairwell that narrowed to single-file width and descended far enough that the temperature dropped significantly. No windows. Torch fixtures on the walls that nobody had bothered to light recently. The smell of old stone and something beneath it that was harder to classify. The undead creature in the chamber was roughly the size of a large horse. It had been something else originally. The original species was no longer identifiable, and the decades of magical modification had left it constructed more from accumulated enchantment than from biology. It occupied the far end of the chamber and became aware of Aster when the door sealed behind him, which it registered by turning its head and beginning to move. Aster drew Graham. The blade formed in the confined space without drama. He measured the creature's approach speed, identified its leading mass, and struck the moment the distance closed to contact range. A full draw cut horizontally through its center section. The blade passed through without significant resistance. The creature's two halves separated, hit the stone floor, and immediately began pulling back together through the regeneration mechanism. Aster hit it again before the reconnection completed. Then again. He established the rhythm. Strike, step, strike. Keep the interval shorter than the rebuild rate. Graham pulled from his reserves without him needing to manage it. The weapon functioned as designed, drawing mana in controlled amounts and converting it cleanly. No destabilization from output that would have overwhelmed a conventional blade. He drove the sequence higher, full power cuts now, each one generating a mana shockwave that spread across the stone walls and lit the chamber in pulses of colorless light. The creature stopped being able to keep pieces together. Smaller fragments tried to reassemble and got hit during the attempt. Aster worked systematically, cutting until the pieces were small enough that the regeneration energy had insufficient material to organize. Then smaller still. Then until the chamber floor held only scattered ash and residue, and the particular texture of the air that had come from the creature's presence was simply absent. He held Graham loosely at his side and breathed. The reserves were lower than he'd prefer. Full draw sequences weren't free, but the headroom was significant. He had more runway left than the fight had required. He knocked on the sealed door. The elders were waiting above, arranged at a distance from the stairwell entrance that suggested they had positioned themselves before the outcome was certain. Zenas stood at the front. When Aster came up the stairs with the hilt at his side and nothing on his coat that required explanation, Zenas looked past him at the dark stairwell for a moment. Aster told him it was finished. Zenas let the silence run. Then he said the branch family's position in the Elmheim structure had been updated. He said additional conversation about the young heir's future would be conducted at an appropriate interval. He said the council session was concluded. He did not say anything regarding what had happened on the mountain road 11 years earlier. Harried had not expected him to. They took their escort and left the estate, and Harried didn't look back at it. Aster did, once, from the road, the main estate at distance in the flat morning light, its scale and its age and its 12,000 knights arranged across the territory behind it. He turned back to the road. The arithmetic had acquired another entry. The elders now knew what his crests could do. The main family would recalculate. The window to the academy had not changed, but what waited on the other side of it might be different from what he'd planned around. He had 4 years to finish preparing. 4 years compressed to nearly nothing when he reached the end of them. Dorasil Royal Knight Academy sat on elevated ground outside the capital, ringed by a perimeter wall that functioned as the first filter, not a gate to enter through, but a distance to be seen from. Arriving candidates were meant to observe the scale before they got close to it. The effect was deliberate. The Academy's administration had maintained the approach road without shade for 300 years, specifically so that incoming students spent the walk studying their own smallness relative to the structure ahead. Aster arrived at 14 with Graham across his back and spent the walk doing other calculations. The candidate pool that year was significant. Roughly 300 applicants from noble and common lines gathered in the entry courtyard with the particular social arrangement such gatherings produced. Noble applicants from prominent houses near the front, common line candidates near the walls, and a layered hierarchy of informal jostling in between. The Elmheim main house had a visible block near the center, their crests displayed with the practiced ease of people accustomed to having their crests noticed. Aster found a position that gave him clean sightlines to the main house group and the exam officials equally, and waited. The first examiner emerged from the main building and walked to the center of the courtyard without addressing the crowd. He raised one hand, and from the ground rose the 12 testing pillars, iron columns, thick and smooth, humming faintly with the defensive enchantments layered into them over the course of decades. The examiner said, without additional ceremony, that any candidate who destroyed a pillar advanced. Those who didn't were free to leave by the south gate. The noble block moved first. A 4-crest candidate from House Ferrant hit his pillar with a full output strike that cracked the surface and left a shallow groove. He stepped back, repositioned, and drove another strike into the same groove. Genuine effort, real commitment. The groove deepened and stopped. The enchantments absorbed and dispersed without giving ground. He hit it 4 more times before stepping back and holding his hands at his sides, breathing controlled, expression not quite neutral. A 3-crest candidate from a minor noble house tried a different approach. Rapid consecutive strikes at the base, attempting to exploit the narrower cross-section. The pillar shed the impacts without visible effect. The common line candidates held back and watched the nobles fail. This told Aster something about their read of the situation. They were learning from the noble attempts before committing their own, which was sensible but slightly wrong, because what those attempts demonstrated was that output volume alone wasn't the answer. The enchantments were dispersal type, not resistance type. You couldn't overwhelm them with more of the same energy they were designed to scatter. You had to introduce something that operated at a different frequency than what they expected. He walked to the nearest available pillar. The noble candidates adjacent to him noted his branch house crest marking and adjusted their attention accordingly, which is to say they reduced it. He placed one open hand against the pillar's surface, feeling the enchantment structure through the contact. Dispersal type, layered, roughly 50 years old. The outer layers were the newest, the core enchantment's original construction. Old construction used different harmonic anchors than modern work. He pushed inward at a frequency that matched the original layering, not the surface additions, and increased the output steadily until the anchor points destabilized. The enchantments didn't shatter, they failed coherently, collapsing inward from the core as the anchors let go, and the pillar came apart from inside, metal parting along the failure lines, the whole structure dissolving into a fine residue that drifted down across the courtyard stone. He stepped back from the empty space where it had been. The examiner wrote something in his register without particular expression. Around the courtyard, approximately 150 candidates had watched the pillar become dust in the time it typically took someone to swing twice, and they processed this in complete silence before the noise came back. The rest of the exam went on for another hour. By the end, 19 candidates had destroyed pillars through various methods, 7 of which had figured out, after watching Aster, that the approach needed to be different from what they'd tried. The examiner acknowledged this by noting that observation and adaptation were also assessed capabilities, and the 7 adapters were marked accordingly. The second trial was announced the following morning. A siege exercise. 300 candidates divided into 3 camps, red, blue, and green, each holding a fortified position on a triangular field. The rule was simple. Any camp that fell surrendered its candidates as prisoners. The last camp standing produced the examination's second-tier qualifiers. The exam officials said this. They did not say that the exam's actual purpose was to observe alliance formation and leadership behaviors under competitive conditions. They didn't need to. Anyone paying attention to the design could read the intent. Aster was assigned to green camp. Grian Elmheim was assigned to red. This was not an accident. The main house had submitted candidate placement requests to the academy, a practice technically prohibited and practically common, and someone in the administration had managed the rosters accordingly. Aster noted this without finding it surprising. Grian was 26, two-crest, and the second son of Duke Roderick, which made him the subtler version of Darius. Darius worked through direct confrontation. Grian worked through arrangement. He had spent the years since the sword dance gathering building a particular kind of relationship with people who found the main house useful, and by the morning of the siege trial he had an understanding with the blue camp's lead noble group that green camp would be isolated and overwhelmed by coordinated pressure from both sides before the first hour was out. The trial began. Grian's red camp held its position. Blue camp moved against green. Standard 2-on-1, well-timed, the kind of early coordination that ended triangular siege exercises quickly and decisively. Green camp's senior noble applicants started a withdrawal toward their fortification's north section, which was the correct instinct tactically, and also exactly what the blue-red coordination had predicted and planned around. Aster didn't go to the north section. He went toward the field boundary between green and blue camps, where a young man with a common line designation was currently holding a narrow choke point with 2 wooden training weapons and the compact, economical technique of someone who had learned to fight without any margin for inefficiency. He was holding the position alone because his 2 support candidates had been separated by the blue camp's advance, and he was doing it with enough technical quality that the 3 blue camp applicants pushing his line hadn't gotten through yet. Aster stepped beside him and hit the nearest blue camp applicant hard enough to sit him down. The other 2 stepped back to reassess. The common line candidate looked at him sideways without stopping his readied stance. His name was Smites. He was 3 years older than Aster, came from a non-noble background, and was in the top tier of common line applicants by sheer processed experience over time. He'd spent years in working combat situations before the academy, which gave him the particular quality of a person who treated getting hit as information rather than an event. He told Aster, still watching the 2 remaining blue applicants, that branch nobles didn't typically hold the common line section. Aster told him he wasn't in a section. He was looking for people worth standing beside. Smites processed this without taking his eyes off the field. After a moment, he asked what Aster needed. Aster said he needed someone who could move across 3 camps and be believed as a neutral party. He said the only way Green Camp survived this trial was if the trial stopped being a 3-camp problem and became something else. He laid out what he was thinking, quickly, in the kind of stripped-down shorthand you used with someone who could track argument velocity without hand-holding. Smites listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was either the best plan he'd heard from a noble in his life, or the kind of thing that sounded good and failed on contact with reality. Aster told him there was one way to find out. Smites went first to the Blue Camp's common line candidates, who had their own concerns about fighting a battle whose benefit would primarily accrue to the noble bloc directing it. He laid out the scenario plainly. If Green fell, the common line contingent in Blue Camp became the noble bloc's lowest priority resource in the one-on-one fight with Red. He was not manufacturing this concern. The structure of the situation genuinely produced it, and the Blue Camp's common line candidates could see it when Smites described it out loud in terms they recognized. He got 12 of them to halt in place and wait for further signal. Aster moved against Grian's position directly. Red Camp's defensive setup was strong. Grian had organized his noble applicants in a sensible layered formation and placed his most reliable candidates at the approach points. He had also, Aster observed, positioned himself at the rear of the formation where the battle's contact wouldn't reach him easily, which reflected his general preferences. Aster went through Red Camp's front line at the left approach, Graham not drawn, just hand-to-hand at the threshold of what he could do while showing approximately 2 crest output, and cleared the approach point quickly enough that the left layer didn't have time to redirect from the front. He found Grian 20 meters into the camp. Grian's expression when he saw who had broken through his forward layer was the expression of someone whose plan had assumed a specific sequence and was now operating several steps outside it. He had a training weapon raised. He was a capable fighter by ordinary academy standards. He made the first move, which Aster let land on his forearm, and then Aster stepped inside his guard, took his weapon wrist with one hand, and applied leverage downward. The weapon dropped. Grian went to one knee, wrist controlled, and looked up. Aster told him the trial was over. He said Grian could acknowledge this now, or Aster could walk him by the wrist across the field to the exam officials and acknowledge it there. He said either option worked. Grian's face arranged itself through several options before settling on contained fury. He asked what Aster wanted. Aster said he wanted Red Camp to stand down. He said the blue-red coordination was visible to the officials, who were recording it, and the only question was whether this ended as Grian's attempted sabotage of a junior candidate or as a misalignment that the camp heads collectively resolved. He released Grian's wrist and stepped back. Grian straightened. He looked at the exam official observation platform at the field's edge, where 3 officials had been watching the last 4 minutes with the particular attention of people who had been waiting for a situation to clarify. He looked back at Aster. He said, with the flat precision of someone recording a debt rather than conceding a position, that he understood. He walked to the center of the field and gave the signal for Red Camp to stand down. Aster gathered the 3 camps' lead candidates at the field's midpoint. He proposed a restructure. All 3 camps merge into a single alliance, present to the officials as a collective pass, and request that the exam's outcome be recorded as a full group completion rather than a last camp standing result. The Academy rules prohibited only a camp's destruction. They did not prohibit alliance formation because the designers had not anticipated anyone attempting it. The loophole was real. Using it required getting the other camp's lead candidates to agree, which required them to believe the officials would honor it, which required that the proposal reach the officials before anyone could object to the precedent. Aster walked to the observation platform himself. He presented the situation to the senior examiner as a query about rule application. The 3 camps had formed an alliance that had resolved the trial without any camp's destruction. Did the alliance collectively qualify, or was the Academy's position that a trial with no loser produced no winner? The senior examiner looked at him for a moment. She looked at her rule documentation. She looked at the 300 candidates arranged on the field in what appeared to be a single unified grouping rather than 3 competing factions. She wrote something in her register. She said all candidates were considered to have completed the entrance examination. She said further assignments would be communicated that evening. 300 candidates passed that year. the first complete field pass in the Academy's history. The exam officials would write about it in the annual report without clearly explaining how it had happened. The Academy grounds held 16 dormitory wings, a central training complex, a weapons depot, a medical building, and a cafeteria large enough to seat the full student body in a single sitting. The cafeteria was where Aster found out what had happened to Alphen. 3 days after the entrance exam, the current student body assembled for the annual orientation meal, a formality where senior students introduced themselves to incoming candidates. Department heads said the expected things about Academy traditions, and the established social order of the student body made itself visible to the new arrivals through the seating arrangements and the relative silence or noise at different tables. Aster had tracked Alphen's enrollment 2 years earlier through branch family correspondence. She was 16 now, 2 years into the Academy program, and ought to be at one of the mid-table positions reserved for second-year students. He found her at a different table. She was seated beside a senior student Aster didn't recognize. Tall, wide-shouldered, with a 5 crest marking, and the elaborate seating position of someone whose family had paid for a specific kind of influence. 2 other students sat on Alphen's other side. Alphen's posture was correct, and her expression was politely attentive, and she was wearing something around her face that Aster identified, with a drop of cold clarity, as an iron shackle. It was a partial unit, not the full mask he'd seen in historical descriptions, but the restraint component across her jaw and cheekbones, locked with a small mana seal. Subtle enough that from across the cafeteria, it could have been mistaken for an unusual piece of jewelry. Close enough that he could see it wasn't. The senior student with 5 crests was Julius Elmheim, main house, eldest son of a collateral branch above branch family Harried's level, heir to a set of titles that gave him nominal authority over Academy students from subordinate lines and a personality structured around exploiting that authority as widely as possible. He was 20, 2 years from graduating, and had spent his Academy tenure installing a specific arrangement among the underclassmen under main house jurisdiction. Iron shackles on selected students, control of their eating and sleeping schedules, obedience produced by gradual erosion rather than direct confrontation. The girl beside him in the partial restraint was the 3rd such student under his management this year. Beside Julius sat a girl with the same family marking, Lillian Elmheim, his younger sister, 18, and carrying 2 crests and a particular quality of pleasant ruthlessness. She had spotted Aster across the cafeteria at approximately the same moment he registered the shackle, and she watched him with the relaxed attention of someone expecting a specific kind of scene. Aster moved to their table without hurry. Julius looked up. His initial assessment of Aster went quickly through the branch house marking, the Graham hilt, and the entrance exam record, which had clearly been briefed to him, and settled into the particular focus of someone determining whether a situation was amusing or inconvenient. Aster looked at Alphen. She turned her head toward him. The restraint constrained jaw movement without preventing it entirely, and she kept her expression carefully arranged, but her eyes held a specific quality. Not fear, not pleading, something more like a person in a cold room who had stopped being surprised by the temperature and was now simply waiting. She looked at him for a moment, then returned to facing forward. Aster told Julius he would like to understand the arrangement his sister was part of. Julius explained it with the ease of someone describing a normal administrative structure. The iron shackle system was a traditional academy practice among the leading Elmheim students. Incoming students from affiliated lines who needed cultivation in discipline and loyalty were placed under senior guidance for a structured period. The practice had been ongoing for several generations. The Academy administration acknowledged it as an internal family matter. The current candidates under guidance included several promising students who were progressing appropriately. Lillian added, from beside her brother, that the branch family's new arrival might find the system educational if he approached it with an open disposition. Aster asked Julius what the process was for removing a student from the arrangement. Julius said the senior guide determined duration based on the student's demonstrated progress. He said it was not a process that responded to outside requests. Aster looked at Alphen again. She was not looking back. She was watching her plate with the focused attention of someone who had learned that the distance between herself and the people watching her was safer when maintained. He told Julius he wanted to propose a different arrangement. He said he was willing to wear an iron shackle himself for 10 days. No food, no water, the full constraint, standard terms. in exchange for the removal of the shackle on his sister, and the release from the arrangement of every other student Julius currently held under it. The cafeteria noise around them had already been declining. Now it stopped in a radius that extended 3 tables in every direction. Julius looked at him for a moment longer than the immediate response would have required. He said 10 days under the shackle, without food or water, would require a level of endurance that the Branch family's new candidate might want to think carefully about. He said the shackle didn't just prevent eating, it eroded willpower over time through sustained discomfort, a sustained low-level attack on the bearer's resistance, designed to make the 10th day feel entirely different from the first. He said that most people who agreed to extended shackle terms didn't understand what they were agreeing to until day 4 or 5, at which point understanding it fully didn't help. Aster said he understood what it was. Julius said he would also want the same guarantee he required of his other candidates. If Aster broke from the terms voluntarily, the shackle on Alphen went back on and stayed on for the remainder of her academy enrollment. Aster said those terms were acceptable. Lillian set down her fork. She looked at her brother with an expression that contained something Aster identified as genuine curiosity about how this played out. Julius told Aster to extend his hands. He produced the shackle unit from somewhere under the table, full version, not the partial restraint Alphen wore, and locked it across Aster's jaw and cheekbones with the mana seal. It settled into place with a click that had no physical weight but registered in a different way, a sustained pressure at the edge of sensation, like the moment before pain without progressing to it. The soul erosion component worked slowly, continuously, below the threshold of dramatic effect. It was designed to be hard to measure in any given moment and impossible to ignore over time. Alphen's shackle came off at the table. Her hands went to her jaw the moment it released, not dramatically, just the small reflexive motion of someone re-encountering ordinary sensation. She looked at Aster with an expression that had too much in it to organize quickly, and she pressed her lips together and looked away. Julius told his other candidates under guidance that they were released for the current enrollment period. He said this with the cheerful manner of someone comfortable with any outcome of a situation he considered favorable to himself. Aster went back to his dormitory assignment and began day 1 of 10. The first 2 days were straightforwardly unpleasant. No food, no water, the sustained low-level pressure of the shackle running continuously, a physical experience he could analyze and endure in the same way he managed other physical problems, through attention management and the kind of patience that came from understanding exactly how much of something was required. He drilled through the mornings, attended curriculum sessions in the afternoons, and gave the shackle no more of his focus than it demanded in any given moment. The third day was harder. Hunger operated differently past the 48-hour point. Less a desire and more an instruction from the body's management systems, consistent and difficult to redirect attention away from. He drilled through it. He ate nothing. By day 5, thirst was the more urgent problem. The body treated water shortage differently than food shortage, with less philosophical about it, and the shackle's pressure had compounded over the days into something he could no longer simply observe from a distance. It sat against him at a frequency that made sleep shallow and concentration slightly more costly than usual. He adjusted his drilling to account for what was available. On the 6th evening, Nolan found him at the edge of the training yard. Nolan was from House Nolan, a prominent noble family with no Elmheim affiliation, who had sent their heir to the academy on their own terms, and with instructions to stay clear of the main house's internal politics. He was 15, 2 crests, technically excellent and honest about his own standing, in a way that most noble heirs at that level were not. He had watched the cafeteria exchange from 3 tables away, and had spent the 6 subsequent days deciding what he thought about it. He told Aster he thought the 10-day arrangement was either extremely stupid or extremely principled, and he was not sure which. Aster told him the distinction probably wasn't important. Nolan said he'd been watching Julius's management of his candidates for a year and a half and had been doing nothing about it, and that sitting at a table 3 positions away from a 14-year-old accepting a 10-day torture arrangement in exchange for other people's freedom had made him want to do something about it. He said he wasn't sure what that looked like, but he wanted to be useful if the opportunity arose. Aster told him to keep his eyes on Julius's candidate list and note if any names changed or if new restraints appeared. He said having a witness whose family had no Elmheim obligation was worth more than most forms of direct help. Nolan nodded. He left Aster in the training yard without making it a significant moment, which Aster appreciated. The seventh day arrived with the particular quality of late-stage physical privation. Everything slightly too slow, peripheral sensation reduced, the body operating on the absolute minimum it could extract from available reserves. The shackle's erosion had accumulated into something no longer at the edge of consciousness. It was persistent and central, and Aster managed it the way he managed everything that couldn't be removed, by working around it, keeping the drills to output levels he could sustain, tracking the countdown. He was in the training yard's eastern section when the sound came from behind him. 4 candidates. He registered them without turning. Footstep weight and distribution. The particular arrangement of people who had formed into a group with a shared intention. Manhwa junior students, he gauged from their step patterns. They stopped at the edge of striking range. The lead candidate told him that 7 days without water was notable endurance, and he should consider that the terms were making him look foolish. He said there were ways to end the arrangement that would not constitute a voluntary break, if Aster understood the implication. Aster understood it. He was also, in that moment, running at a reserve level that should have made what he did next inadvisable, which was the only interesting aspect of it. He turned. His arms were at his sides. Graham was across his back, but he didn't reach for it. The lead candidate moved first. Training weapon up. Full commitment strike aimed to land hard, and call it a training accident if needed. The weapon came down in a clean arc at the angle of someone who had practiced the motion. Aster exhaled. The breath carried mana with it. Not through a weapon, not structured through Graham's regulation, just pushed out of his body through the technical control he'd built over 14 years of managing 7 crests in a frame that had never fully recovered from what was done to it in a previous life. The mana organized into a cutting edge in the half-second before impact. It took the training weapon above the handle and separated it cleanly, leaving the candidate holding the grip and nothing else. The cutting edge continued past the weapon and caught the next candidate across the padded practice armor on his leading arm, not deeply but definitely, and he stepped back hard. 2 of the 4 were now outside striking range. The other 2 looked at their lead candidate holding a severed grip. Aster stood at the center of it, 7 days empty, the shackle running its constant erosion, mana thread already dissolving back into the air. His breathing was controlled. He told them the training yard was closing for the evening, and they should consider somewhere else. They left. He held still for a moment after they were gone, then sat down on the low wall at the yard's edge and let himself breathe at cost for a minute. The weaponless cut had drawn more than he preferred on the current reserves, but it had closed. He ran the arithmetic on what remained and found it workable. 3 more days. In the main house dormitory building, someone reported to Julius that the branch candidate had released a wind cutter technique on day 7 without a weapon, while wearing the shackle, operating at severe privation. Julius listened to this with the expression of a man adjusting a calculation he had believed was settled. Day 8 arrived without ceremony. The body at that stage had moved past active protest into something quieter and more fundamental. A sustained reduction in everything peripheral. The organism routing available resources toward the core and letting the edges go dark. Aster noticed it the way a person noticed a change in weather. Practically, without excess interpretation. His hands were slower than usual. The training yard's dimensions seemed to have shifted slightly in his perception, distances slightly compressed. He drilled at half the output he'd have used on a normal morning and tracked the cost of each movement against what remained. The shackle's erosion had become something he no longer needed to consciously monitor. He simply lived alongside it, a sustained companion operating at the bottom of his attention at all hours, including sleep. Julius walked through the dormitory wing on the morning of day 8. His routine brought him past the common areas where first-year candidates gathered before morning curriculum, and he moved through them with the proprietary ease of a person accustomed to people adjusting their position when he approached. He stopped once, in the main corridor, where Alphen was standing with 2 other candidates she'd been released alongside. She looked at him with an expression that gave him nothing. He moved on. He had not expected Aster to reach day 8. He was revising several assumptions. Lillian found him in his study that afternoon and said so plainly. She told her brother that 4 candidates' worth of controlled students had gone uncontrolled for 8 days now because of a 14-year-old with a shackle on his face, and the calculation on whether finishing this particular arrangement favorably was still possible needed to be re-examined. Julius told her to sit down. He spent the next hour reviewing what he knew about the branch candidate's crest count, combat record, and the academy record of the siege exam outcome, and at the end of the hour he sent a message to the main estate. Word from the main house arrived the following morning. Aster never saw the content, but its effect was legible. Julius's posture shifted, and a particular quality of calculation that had been running openly on his face for the past several days went internal. Day 9 was the hardest. The body's remaining protest was exhausted, which left something more direct in its place. Not pain exactly, but a fundamental insistence that what was happening should not be happening, running at a frequency that made every hour slightly heavier than the last. The shackle's accumulated erosion worked at the same substrate as willpower. Aster understood the mechanism. Knowing the mechanism didn't reduce the pressure. He went to the training yard at the usual time. Smites was there. Smites had been showing up to the morning sessions without explanation for 4 days. He didn't train with Aster or speak to him during the sessions, mostly because Aster wasn't in a state to make conversation productive, but he occupied the far end of the yard with his own drills and was present when Aster arrived and still there when he left. The quality of his presence was uncomplicated. He had decided to keep proximity, so he kept it. No ceremony around it. Nolan was at the observation bench most mornings with a cup of tea he didn't offer, because there was obviously no point, and his record book, making entries that had nothing to do with what Aster was doing. He looked up once on day 9 when Aster paused mid-drill, hand on his knee, breathing controlled but costing more than usual. Nolan looked back at his record book. He did not say anything about what he had seen, which was the correct reading of what was wanted. Aster straightened and finished the drill sequence. The evening of day 9, Alphen was waiting in the corridor outside the training complex. She looked at him in the low light of the corridor torches. 14 years old on his side of the exchange, 16 on hers. 7 days of accumulated strain visible in his face, in ways he couldn't see himself, but that were apparently legible from where she stood. She said nothing immediately. The shackle sat across his jaw in the light, its mana seal's faint pulse visible if you knew to look. She told him he was an idiot. He asked her, through the constraint on his jaw, if she had come down to the corridor specifically to tell him that. She said she had come to tell him he had 3 days' worth of food ready in his room for when this was over, because she had been adding to it since day 1 and it was now taking up most of his desk. She said he would eat every piece of it if he knew what was good for him. She said the next time he decided to wear a torture device for 10 days on someone else's behalf, he should consult her beforehand, because she had opinions about it. He told her he would consider that. She pressed her lips together and looked at him for another moment. She turned and walked back down the corridor toward the women's dormitory wing, and her back was straight and her pace was even, and she walked like someone who had made a decision and was committed to the aftermath of it. He watched her go and thought, not for the first time, about the difference between the family that had made him and the one that had kept him. Day 10 opened clear and cold. Aster dressed before light reached the window and sat with Graham in his lap and counted the hours. By his measurement, the shackle's term expired at midday. He didn't go to the training yard. He sat. The shackle's erosion ran at its standard depth, same as every other morning, indifferent to the count of days. His reserves were lower than he'd have liked, and his hands, when he held them out, were not entirely steady. He watched them without particular concern, the way he'd watched everything over the past 10 days, as data, as something to account for, not as a verdict. Julius arrived at his door at exactly midday. He came alone, which surprised Smites, who had been in the corridor and had to relocate quickly. Julius carried the shackle's release key in one hand and wore the expression of a man who had decided on a particular performance and intended to deliver it cleanly. He told Aster to stand. Aster stood. Julius examined the shackle seal, found it unbroken, no voluntary release, no breach of terms, and applied the key to the mana lock. The mechanism released. The shackle came off. The absence of the sustained pressure was physical and immediate, like a sound stopping that had been present so long it had become ambient. Aster moved his jaw carefully, feeling the unfamiliar absence of constraint. His hands he kept at his sides. He did not rub his face where the shackle had sat, though he was aware of the impulse. Julius looked at him. His expression had settled into something that operated independently of what he was feeling, and what he was feeling was not quite what any of the preceding days had prepared him to feel in this position. He had built the shackle arrangement over 2 years on a precise understanding of what 10 days of combined starvation and soul erosion did to people. He had watched capable warriors, older and better rested than this boy, come off 10-day terms as different people from who they'd gone in. Quieter, more careful about agreement, oriented toward accommodation. The shackle didn't break people dramatically. It cultivated a particular pliability that was hard to identify and harder to reverse. The person standing in front of him was looking back with the same quality of attention he'd had on day 1. Julius told Aster the terms were complete and the matter was concluded. He turned to leave. Aster said his name. Julius stopped. Aster told him the arrangement was concluded and the terms were met. He also told him that any student from any family currently enrolled at Dorasil Royal Knight Academy who came to Aster reporting an iron shackle placement would have that report taken to the academy director, whose name was Earl Mays, with the complete documentation that Nolan had been collecting for 8 days on his behalf. He said this without inflection, the way a person reported a standing policy rather than issuing a warning. Julius's shoulders moved slightly. He turned back. He said the academy director had his own relationship with the Elmheim family and would not find that documentation compelling. Aster said he was interested to see. Julius looked at him for a full 3 seconds. He left. The food Alphen had left on his desk was, as she'd described, extensive. She had organized it by type and covered each section with cloth to keep it fresh, and she had left a brief note on top specifying which items were for immediate eating and which were for later and why. He read the note. He ate slowly, following the note's sequence, because eating too fast after 10 days of nothing was a medical situation he had no interest in creating. He worked through the immediate priority items over the course of 2 hours and drank water in careful intervals and sat on the edge of his bed and let the body reallocate resources toward whatever it had been rationing. Smites knocked, came in without waiting for a response, and sat in the desk chair facing backward. He announced he was staying until Aster looked like he might survive, because he had spent 10 days watching the process and had developed an investment in the conclusion. He asked how the food was. Aster told him it was thorough. Smites said Alphen had recruited 4 other candidates to contribute items, which meant the desk situation had become a collaborative project by day 6, and none of the contributors felt they could take their items back without social consequence. He said this explained the variety. Aster looked at the desk. The variety was significant. Smites said he also wanted to report that the 4 candidates Julius had been managing before the cafeteria exchange had been watching how the 10 days went, and 2 of them had told Smites they were prepared to add their accounts to Nolan's documentation if needed. He said he hadn't asked them. They'd come to him. Aster told Smites that was worth knowing. Smites said he thought so. He looked at the desk again, picked up an item that was clearly in the later eating section, looked at Aster, put it back. Recovery took 3 days. He didn't rush it. On the 4th day after the shackle came off, the 4th grade curriculum began its combat rotation, an 8-week series of practical combat assessments where first-year students were evaluated by senior students and department instructors across a series of controlled match formats. The rotation assigned opponents by academy grade rather than enrollment year, which meant first-year students demonstrating high-grade output would be matched accordingly, moving up the tier structure as their results warranted. The matching algorithm had Aster in a 6th grade bracket for the first session, which was where all incoming first years began regardless of their entrance exam results. The 6th grade bracket contained 11 other first-year candidates and 4 second-year students whose combat results had placed them in the lowest tier for reassessment. Aster went through his first session matches in 2 hours. The bracket advanced him to 5th grade for the following session. He spent 2 sessions in the 5th grade bracket. The matches were more technical than the 6th. Candidates here had developed actual frameworks rather than relying on raw output, and a few of them had genuine quality in their approaches. He worked through them with the careful respect of someone taking each match as its own problem, not as a runway to something else. He lost no sessions. The bracket advanced him again. The 4th grade grouping contained students in their 2nd and 3rd years, some with 4 crests, all with enough academy-specific training that the matches had genuine texture. He found 3 candidates in this bracket whose approaches he hadn't encountered before, and spent extra time on those matches than their outcomes required, mapping the techniques thoroughly. Word moved through the student body the way word moved when something unexpected was happening in a place where outcomes were tracked. quietly, specifically, at the speed of people who knew what to look for. Julius noticed the progression from the documentation that crossed his desk as senior Elmheim representative. He had been watching the bracket results since day one of the rotation. He had not done anything with what he was watching, because the message from the main estate on day 9 of the shackle had been clear. The branch candidate was not to be interfered with through the academy structure until the estate had completed its own assessment of the situation. Julius held to this with the particular discipline of someone who understood that the instruction came from a level that didn't need to justify itself. But the 4th grade bracket results were being read by people other than Julius. Earl Mays reviewed the combat rotation assessments at the end of each week as standard administrative practice. He was 63, Academy Director for 19 years, the nominal author of a dozen curriculum reforms and the actual author of considerably more. He had the professional patience of someone who had watched talent arrive, develop, be wasted, and occasionally produce something remarkable across 2 decades of close observation. He read the first-year candidates' session results for that week and read them again more carefully, and made a notation in his personal files that was not part of the standard administrative record. He sent a message to the 4th grade curriculum head asking that first-year candidate Aster, from Branch House Elmheim, be flagged for a director-level assessment at the rotation's midpoint. The message went through normal channels and arrived on the 4th grade head's desk without any visible urgency, and the head filed it accordingly. Aster received the notification the following morning along with his standard session assignment. Smites, reading over his shoulder without invitation, said a director-level assessment at the rotation's midpoint for a first-year candidate was not something that happened in the normal administrative sequence, and Aster should probably know what he was walking into. Aster told him he was aware. Smites asked if he had a theory about Earl Mays's interest. Aster said he had several. He hadn't yet determined which one was correct, and determining which one was correct before the meeting was the relevant task. Smites said he understood, and left the remaining sections of the food Alphen hadn't yet cleared off the desk, on the reasoning that Aster appeared to still be in the eating everything phase and should be supported in that. The combat rotation continued. 3rd grade bracket, week 2. A senior student named Edris from House Creth, 5th crest, 3rd year, reputation for technical precision, and a preference for distance-based wind mana techniques. Aster registered this match as the first genuine test of the rotation, someone whose methodology was actually designed rather than assembled, whose crests outmatched his displayed output by a meaningful margin, and who would read a conservative showing as the ceiling rather than as a choice. He did not give a conservative showing. He came into the match at a level of output that made Edris recalibrate within the first 40 seconds, and he let the match run long enough that both of them had worked through their primary approaches and arrived at the interesting layer underneath, where technique replaced math and decisions made faster than conscious reasoning produced outcomes. Edris was good. The match found its quality in the middle third, after the initial adjustment, when both of them were working at actual depth and the gallery of students that had accumulated outside the match venue were quiet in the way audiences went quiet when they recognized something worth watching. Aster won at the 7-minute mark when he closed the distance on a wind mana exchange that Edris's range preference made psychologically difficult to anticipate. He stepped inside the wind technique at the moment of release, took the partial impact on Graham's energy blade, and struck while Edris was still processing the positional reversal. Edris stood down. He looked at Aster with the specific attention of someone forming a considered opinion rather than an emotional response, and told him the inside close on a wind release at full deployment was reckless and ought not to have worked. Aster said it required precise timing and shouldn't be attempted against someone whose wind techniques had less delay at release. Edris said he was aware that was a technical note about his own methodology, delivered in the phrasing of agreement, and he was going to review his release timing over the following week. Aster said he thought that was worthwhile. 2 students in the gallery started talking before they'd fully left the venue. Aster heard none of it, but by that evening the shape of the conversation had reached Lillian through the channels she maintained, and she sat with it in her dormitory and thought about what Julius had received from the main estate, and whether it was still the appropriate instruction given current information. Julius had the same question. He sent a second message to the main estate that night. Not a request, an update. describing the combat rotation results with the flat precision of a man ensuring that people above him had current data before the decisions those people were managing caught up to him. He sent it without particular urgency and waited. The response arrived 2 days later and contained one line from his father's secretary. "Hold. The estate is watching." Julius read it twice. He placed it in his desk drawer. He attended the following day's curriculum sessions with his expression arranged in the mode he used when managing patients, and he did not speak to Aster or make any visible adjustment to his routine. The director-level assessment was scheduled for a morning at the end of week 2. Earl Mays met Aster in the assessment chamber on the administrative wing's eastern side. A small room, no gallery seating, a practice floor and 2 chairs, and a window that faced the main training complex. He was already seated when Aster arrived, reviewing a document that he set aside without urgency. He was not accompanied by Academy staff. He looked at Aster for a moment before saying anything. He said the combat rotation results were notable. Aster said he appreciated the assessment opportunity. Mays said he was not talking about the results as achievement. He was talking about them as information, about a candidate who had come through an entrance exam that no previous cohort had completed without elimination, gone through a 10-day shackle trial that most third-year students would not attempt, and produced third-grade bracket results in week 2 of the first-year rotation. He said he was interested in the candidate's actual situation, not in the candidate's performance as reported. Aster asked him what distinction he was drawing between those two things. Mays said the performance record described a branch house candidate with exceptional ability. The situation, which included the specific family relationship, the history at the sword dance gathering, the shackle arrangement and how it concluded, and the main estate's current posture toward the branch line, described something considerably more complex, and he was in the habit of understanding complex things fully before they produced administrative problems. He said he was also in the habit of telling people when he had an interest in their outcome, because concealing that interest while acting on it was dishonest, and he found dishonesty inefficient. Aster looked at him. Mays said Earl Mays was not a name with Elmheim affiliation. His family had a historical relationship with the branch lines that predated current Elmheim authority by 2 generations, and he was the academy director because the academy's founding charter specified that the directorship operated outside noble house jurisdiction. He said the iron shackle arrangement Julius ran was something he had documentation of and had not yet acted on, for reasons related to political timing that he was prepared to explain if Aster wanted the full picture. Aster said he wanted the full picture. Mays said Julius's removal required a formal Academy Council procedure that needed a quorum of department heads, 3 of whom currently had Elmheim-adjacent appointments that would need to be managed before a vote could produce a clean outcome. He said the documentation Nolan had assembled was sufficient evidence. The timing was the remaining variable. He said the branch family's new candidate, arriving in the current enrollment period, had altered the timing. Aster asked how. Mays said a director-level assessment result that placed a first-year candidate at second-grade equivalent output would give him grounds to accelerate a student's placement track, which was within his administrative authority and outside the main house's influence on the academy roster. He said an accelerated student in a high-visibility placement bracket was much harder for the main family to quietly manage than a first-year candidate in standard rotation. He said he was proposing that Aster show him something genuine in the assessment chamber today, and that the record of what he showed would be used accordingly. Outside the window, the main training complex was visible. The large central yard where 200 students were drilling in the morning light. Crests active, mana moving in the clean, organized patterns of supervised practice. The scale of it. The weight of the institution behind it. Aster looked at it for a moment, then looked back at Mays. He said he understood the proposal. He stood up and picked up Graham. The blade formed in the chamber's confined space, longer than usual, a full output draw that the restricted room couldn't entirely contain, mana pressing outward at the edges of the floor space with enough force that the window latch rattled, and the document on Mays's chair lifted slightly and resettled. Aster held it for 3 seconds, not performing, just holding. The actual ceiling of what he ran at current recovery level. 7 crests pulling in concert. Graham converting the draw without destabilization. Then he released it. The blade dissolved. Mays sat still for a moment in the space where the output had been. Then he wrote something in his document at unhurried length. He said the assessment was complete and the placement record would be updated. He said Aster should expect a curriculum reassignment by the end of the week. He also said that when the council procedure against Julius began, a witness account from Aster's cohort would be valuable, and he hoped that could be arranged. Aster said it could. Mays nodded. He returned to his document as though the conversation were concluded, which it was, and Aster took his leave. In the corridor outside the administrative wing, Aster stood for a moment in the building's quiet. The long hallway stretched left toward the dormitory wings and right toward the main training complex, and somewhere between those two directions the next several months were already in motion. Julius's message to the estate, Mays's council procedure, the placement reassignment, the main house watching from a distance and deciding what the watching required. He had come to this academy with an arithmetic. The entries had shifted since arrival. Mays's interest a variable he hadn't anticipated. Nolan's documentation a resource he hadn't sourced. Smite's a category of person his previous life hadn't prepared him to expect. He ran the current numbers and found the balance changed, but the direction unchanged. He started toward the training complex. In a practice room 2 wings from where Aster walked, Julius received a notification from the Academy administrative system. First-year candidate Aster, Branch House Elmheim, placement reassigned to 2nd grade combat curriculum, effective the following week. Director's order, no countersign required. He read it twice. He looked at his desk drawer where the estate's most recent message sat. Hold, the estate is watching. He picked up a pen and began a third message. He did not use the formal channel this time. He addressed it directly to his father. He said the Branch family's candidate had received director-level backing and a 2nd grade placement at week 2 of his first-year rotation, and that Earl Mays had moved faster than the estate's assessment timeline had anticipated. He said if the estate intended to act on the Branch situation before it compounded further, the window was narrowing, and he needed to know whether his current instructions still stood. He sealed the message and gave it to his fastest courier. On a training field behind the dormitory complex, Alphen drilled with 2 of the candidates she'd been released alongside. Both of them lighter now, back into their own rhythms after the shackle period, rebuilding the habits the erosion had worked on. She moved through the form sequence with the clean technique of someone who had spent the idle weeks of the shackle period rehearsing mentally rather than resting. Her timing was better than before. She noticed this and filed it. At the field's edge, she paused. She looked across the complex toward the administrative wing, where Aster was somewhere in a meeting she hadn't been told about, in an institution that had already demonstrated in the first 3 weeks that being the main family's focus was a different kind of dangerous from being the main family's forgotten branch. She picked up her training sword and went back to the form sequence. The courier reached the main estate before sunset and placed Julius's letter in the hands of Duke Roderick Elmheim's personal secretary. The secretary read it, set it to one side, and brought it to the Duke at the end of the day's appointments. Roderick read it at his desk in the last light, with the flat expression of a man processing information that confirmed something he had already been thinking about. He told the secretary to send for Grian.